U.S. elections are coming up, and the race has put the voting rights debate front and center. How does the Constitution stop racism? And should the U.S. government pass policies based on protecting certain races? Welcome to America Uncovered. I'm Chris Chappell. If you haven't heard, the presidential, Senate, and congressional elections are coming up in November. And if you haven't heard, got any extra room under that rock you're living under? It sounds peaceful. One way Democrats and Republicans are competing is through redistricting. You see, whenever there's a new census, congressional district lines within each state get changed based on new population data. Yep, congressional lines are fluid, just like your non-binary cousin Taylor. The congressional district lines can effectively decide whether Democrats or Republicans will win seats in Congress. For example, in 2022, race was front and center in the fight over congressional lines in Alabama. Many called it a continuation of the fight for equality seen during the Jim Crow era.
For generations, Alabama has been home to seminal civil rights battles. It was here that Rosa Parks and Dr. Martin Luther King led the fight against Jim Crow laws. Now activists say there's a new front line for equality: redistricting.
We would ask that federal courts would intervene and require them to look at the population, to look at the voting history of our state, and to produce maps that actually give Black Alabamians a chance to elect candidates of their choice in a way that actually represents their population.
Critics had a beef with the way the Alabama legislature, led by Republicans, used the 2020 census to carve up the state's 7 districts. Most of Alabama's black voters are packed into the 7th district, which has long voted Democrat, while the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd districts are divided up in a way that gives white voters and Republicans an advantage. It's a little suspicious that these districts were shaped like someone with a rubber spine doing yoga. As a result, black voters controlled just 14% of congressional districts, despite making up nearly a third of the state's population. The argument goes that this is unequal because black voters are a voting bloc. Of course, this assumes that all black people think the same way, have the same political interests, and must depend on getting representatives preferred by minorities, which is problematic in its own way. But in general, blacks are more likely to vote for Democrats than for Republicans. Just don't mention that around Candace Owens, unless you have time to sit through a 9-hour rant. This political tactic of packing and dividing up district lines is called gerrymandering. And in Alabama's case, critics accused Republicans of racial gerrymandering. If you want to learn more about gerrymandering, check out this episode covering the topic. The link is below. Essentially, it's the political equivalent of playing the board game Operation. Just pull out the voters you want without touching the sides. Gerrymandering takes a lot of factors into consideration, race being one of them. But using race as the primary factor for drawing district lines could be in violation of Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. That section says no voting practice or political subdivision can deny or abridge any citizen's right to vote on account of race or color. And I agree, you shouldn't deny anyone's right to vote based on the color of their skin. You should deny their right to vote based on whether or not they enjoy young Sheldon. Anyone who does gets to vote, because we have great taste. Bazinga! At any rate, several years ago, Alabama officials chose a new electoral map. People sued, saying it was unfair. It eventually went to the U.S. Supreme Court, where in 2023, judges shot it down for intentionally minimizing the power of black votes. Eventually, federal judges stepped in to divide the state into new districts, which increased the representation of black votes. At least it increases the power of black votes if you assume the vast majority of blacks will continue to vote for Democrats. Because the answer to gerrymandered districts is someone else gerrymandering the districts. I feel like someone somewhere is missing the point. I'm not sure if that's going to make the districts look like a more or less advanced yoga pose. The point is, the court battle over whether voting districts are racist highlights an important issue. Is the U.S. Constitution supposed to be race neutral? And how would that actually work in practice? I'll explain after the break. Welcome back. In Alabama's case, Republicans who wanted to keep the original districts they had proposed claimed that the Constitution requires them to be colorblind. The 14th Amendment states that no state shall make or enforce any law which shall deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. Alabama Republicans argued that the Equal Protection Clause of the Constitution's 14th Amendment is interpreted as race neutral, and so any attempt to consider race in redistricting would violate the equal protection of white voters. Technically, I think it could violate the equal protection of black voters too, especially black Republicans, but that didn't come up in the arguments, probably because Candace Owens wasn't there. According to Alabama, the court should therefore adopt a race-blind test when considering whether a state should be required under the Voting Rights Act to draw districts in which most people are racial minorities. Essentially, they're saying that by trying to not be racist, you wind up being racist. Wait, so does this mean that if you try to be racist, you wind up not being racist? I don't know, but maybe let's not experiment with that. But Supreme Court Justice Ketanji Jackson said the U.S. Constitution, especially the 14th and 15th Amendments, which bar race-based voting discrimination, was made in a race-conscious way, not a colorblind way. According to her, the framers and ratifiers of the amendments intended for race-based remedies for historical wrongs. Therefore, it wouldn't be a violation of the Equal Protection Clause if the Supreme Court required Alabama to gerrymander by race to give blacks a second majority black district. To prove this point, Jackson quoted an 1866 speech by a Pennsylvania Republican representative who helped advance the 14th Amendment.
So I looked at the report that was submitted by the Joint Committee on Reconstruction, which drafted the 14th Amendment, and that report says that the entire point of the amendment was to secure rights of the freed former slaves. The legislator who introduced that amendment said that, quote, unless the Constitution should restrain them, those states will all, I fear, keep up this discrimination and crush to death the hated freedmen. That's not a race-neutral or race-blind idea in terms of the remedy.
Based on this alone, you'd be led to believe that those who argue for colorblindness are against ensuring equal treatment. But history is a little more complicated than that. Plus, it's hard to say what anyone who wrote those amendments might say today. About race, that is. All of them would probably say, "You're letting women vote now? Why?" Abolitionists and advocates for race equality argued for colorblindness during the time of slavery and Jim Crow. They said that since the Constitution didn't explicitly mention race, the Supreme Court couldn't read racial hierarchy into it. For example, in a dissenting opinion against Plessy v. Ferguson, which protected racial segregation with so-called separate but equal, Justice John Harlan celebrated the amendments protecting black rights by removing the race line from the U.S. governmental systems. He also argued against white supremacy by saying that the U.S. Constitution is colorblind. Makes sense, after all, the Constitution is literally black and white, and a little yellow due to aging. The thing is, the whole debate over what it means to be colorblind is really getting into semantics depending on the context. Another Supreme Court justice said the Constitution is both colorblind and color conscious, so they can't see color but are aware it exists. Oh, is that how colorblind drivers know how to use traffic lights? He argued that on the one hand, any laws that do harm based on race violate the Equal Protection Clause. On the other hand, the Constitution tries to stop the perpetuation of discrimination and undo the effects of past discrimination. According to him, the criterion is the relevancy of color to a legitimate government purpose. As far as I know, he didn't define a legitimate government purpose. Some legal historians point out that Congress repeatedly rejected calls for race neutrality made by opponents of race-conscious policies enacted during the Reconstruction era, who argued that the adopted policies would lead to racial discrimination against whites, and instead passed race-conscious measures designed to counter harms faced by non-white citizens. Some left-leaning critics say this is happening now. The right is turning colorblindness from something that once protected blacks to something that oppresses racial progress. So they're saying that trying to not be racist winds up making you racist is racist? I feel like I need a chart. Or if you really want to simplify it, arguments for colorblindness are grounded in white supremacy. Ah yes, it's like that old expression, where there's hesitancy, blame white supremacy. But not every policy that affects blacks explicitly has to be race-based. For example, as left-wing law professor Michael Dorf points out, the Civil Rights Act of 1866, which affirms equal protection under the law, does not contain specifically race-based remedies. And according to a professor at the University of San Diego School of Law, there is no strong evidence for concluding that 6 of the 7 laws enacted by Congress at the time of the 14th Amendment's passing confer race-based benefits. Even laws that do explicitly refer to blacks don't constitute strong evidence of race-based laws. It's possible that the laws protecting blacks were based more on records of prior oppression and discrimination. But as long as the topic of race is on the table, both the left and right will jump at the chance of slugging it out over semantics, especially when votes are on the line. While they continue to miss the easy, obvious solution to all of this. Only let young Sheldon fans vote. Bazinga! So what do you think? Leave your comments below. And if you like the show, remember that we rely mainly on direct support from viewers like you. All it takes is as little as $1 per episode over on our crowdfunding website, Patreon. Visit patreon.com/AmericaUncovered for more. And check out this video I made about Sonic the Hedgehog and what his endless pursuit of gold rings can teach us about self-sufficiency. Once again, I'm Chris Chappell. Thanks for watching America Uncovered.